Oftentimes, we overcomplicate our drawing practice when using the simplest of tools and also using common everyday objects that we have around us at home. We can build up these skills that are incredibly essential, not only your hand-eye coordination and your observational skills, but also your understanding and practice with essential art fundamentals that are going to help you move forward faster and a lot more successfully. Hey everyone, and welcome to another one of my weekly art videos. I hope you're having an amazing day wherever you are in the world, and thanks so much for joining me on this one. Today, I wanted to share a super powerful drawing exercise with you that will help you practice 3D form and perspective, which, based on my own journey, growing my skills, and also having helped so many others grow their own, I know that 3D form and perspective are a couple of the most challenging art fundamentals to wrap our heads around. This exercise is basically to draw one same object from multiple angles or perspectives. And you can decide whether to draw from direct observation or from life, or you can also take photos of the object and then use those photos as references. With all that said, let's jump in. So I am going to explain a little bit about this particular object that I chose to work with for this exercise, as well as what I did to prepare before jumping in. And then I'll be moving on to explaining a few key tips that I always use, which help me draw this kind of object way more effectively. So the object that I chose was a little espresso cup that I had at home. I thought it would be a great challenge for me because of the tapered cylindrical structure and also the handle that mugs and little cups like this can have. If you've ever tried to draw a coffee mug or something with a handle, you probably already know that they can be quite tricky to draw. So what I did after finding this object that I thought would be a good challenge for me and my current skill level was I took a good number of pictures of this object from all different kinds of angles and perspectives. Now, you could definitely work on this exercise from direct observation or from life. You don't necessarily have to take photos of your object. Both work great, and I would recommend that you practice drawing from direct observation, because that is going to help take your skills to a whole new level. But if you do decide to work off reference photos, a couple of tips that I have for you are to make sure that you are taking your photos in a room that has relatively good natural lighting, and also avoid using your camera's flash so that your photo is not over or underexposed and you're able to see highlight areas, mid-tone areas, and darkest areas in case you'd like to take your sketch forward to a shading or value study as well. Another thing is try to have a neutral colored background, or at least a solid color background, so that you don't have objects or patterns that are distracting away from the purpose or objective of your study. Something like a white, off-white, or even black or beige color background would work great. If your object is a light color, consider using a darker color background. And if your object has a darker color, consider using a lighter color background. That contrast is going to help you more clearly see its shape against the background and any negative areas. So for example, in many of these angles or perspectives, we're going to see that quote-unquote hole created by the handle of this little espresso cup. That little hole is a negative space, and sometimes by really observing that negative space, we're better able to recreate shapes and proportions as we're drawing. Sometimes, depending on the object, observing those negative spaces is just as important as observing the positive spaces when it comes to drawing. And another little tip for you is bring in some sort of extra little object that you can use to hold up your object that you're going to be drawing. So in a couple of these reference photos, you're going to notice that I used my kneaded eraser. I placed it under this little cup in order to hold it up at different angles and perspectives so that it didn't fall or move around as I was drawing. All right, and finally, when it comes to the supplies that I used for these sketches, these are very basic basic drawing supplies. I am using a basic drawing sketchbook. This is from Canson. I just brought in a couple of different pencil grades. I started my drawing lightly with an HB pencil, made sure that I arrived at effective shapes and proportions and believable perspective and form. This is the main objective with these studies, and I want to encourage you to spend as much time as you need with that beginning part of the sketching process, because if your form, if your shapes, if your proportions, if your perspective are off, no amount of shading is going to make your drawing look believable. You need to have that sound, solid foundation, and then you can move on to doing your shading. Once those things looked good to me, I continued using my HB pencil to start with a little bit of shading. And my shading is done very quickly, very loosely. I went with alternative shading techniques. I just brought in hatching and cross hatching. I was just observing main areas of midtones and darkest darks in those reference photos. But I started with that value or shading development with my HB pencil. And then when it came time to develop those darker values, I switched to my slightly softer pencil grade, which was a 4B. I used this softer pencil grade to push darkest areas a little bit more with my alternative shading techniques, and I do have a full video in which I explain alternative shading techniques more in depth, as well as how different drawing pencil grades can come in handy and an explanation on basic drawing supplies. I'll make sure to leave links to those videos down below in the text section of this post so that you can go and check them out if you haven't already. Aside from those two pencil grades, I also brought in a couple of different erasers, which were my soft graphite eraser and my kneaded eraser. It is always my objective to keep my drawing nice and light in the beginning and make my way incrementally toward darker and bolder use of my graphite. Whenever I need to fix proportions or shapes or things look a little bit crooked or off, I just go in with my soft graphite eraser and fix that. And whenever I need to clean up my sketch a little bit, maybe things have become a little bit muddy with my graphite or a little bit too dark in certain areas, I go in and do some gentle tapping with my kneaded eraser. So my erasers have different purposes. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to sharing my main tips that always help me when I'm drawing this kind of object, especially when it comes to that first phase of the sketching process where we're focusing on creating that solid foundation that shows believable perspective, proportions, and form. My first tip is, if you're seeing that object in such a way that you're able to see into it and you're able to see that circle or that ellipse, start by recreating that circle or that ellipse to the best of your abilities. Even with the first little sketch here, the one on the far left, I can't see into the cup from that perspective or that angle, but I can see that little ellipse created by what would be the bottom plane of the structure if the cup was upright. I started with that small ellipse and then I built everything after. And if there is a tilt to that object, something that I find incredibly helpful is to lay down a couple of axes. Maybe you've already seen me do this as I was starting these sketches, especially these last two, but I'll be doing it again in the next three. So before actually drawing my ellipse, I lay down this line at an angle. I observe the reference photo and I try to visualize a line running across the ellipse in that photo. You want to look at where the ellipse is at its widest. And I try to visualize a straight line going across the ellipse present in that photo. Imagine a line running from the left edge of the ellipse all the way to the right edge of the ellipse. I try to recreate that line at that angle, and once that line is on my paper, it's easier for me to draw the ellipse at the right tilt. I also often add a second line, which would run right down the middle of that cup, dividing the cup into equal left and right halves, because having that second axis there is going to help me create that symmetry that I need. This middle line is going to help me make sure that the shape that I create for the left half of the object is as close as possible to the shape that I create for the right half of the object. And I'm not always going to be placing my two axes in this specific order. Sometimes I place one first and then the other. And sometimes I even attempt to draw the ellipse before placing my axes to check on the symmetry. It all really depends, but these are the key tools that I use. This cup that I'm drawing right now doesn't really have much of a tilt to it, so I didn't use any axes to help me. However, I did create a few tick marks before starting to actually draw my shapes in order to visualize the height and the width of this cup before starting to draw it. So make the process easier for yourself by drawing straight lines and tick marks to help you get in tilts, proportions, and also symmetry whenever you feel it might be helpful. Just keep them nice and light. I have another full video in which I explain why drawing circles and ovals and ellipses is so challenging, and I provide very helpful exercises on this, which I'll make sure to link to down below in the text section of this post. This said, you can see that my circles and my ellipses are by no means perfect, and at the end, my sketches still turn out pretty good. They still convey that believable 3D form and perspective. And the next tips that I have for you have to do with drawing the handle, which, as I said before, can definitely be quite tricky. First and foremost, don't start adding the handle until the bulk or the main part of the structure is sound, okay? We always want to work from general towards specific or from large to small. But once you're ready to start adding in the handle, what I would recommend doing first is visualizing that connection where the smaller handle structure is connected to the base large structure. Where is that connecting point or connecting points? If you notice, the first thing that I did with all of these, once it was time to start drawing the handle, was to draw a shape on the larger structure so that I can really understand what the correct location of that handle is in relation to the base structure. And once I had that in, I started actually drawing the shape of the handle itself. Initially, I just see the handle as a flat shape. And I try to get in the proportions of the handle in relation to the larger base structure right before starting to turn that shape into a 3D form. Remember that getting proportions right is all about getting those relationships between the different parts making up the whole right. We want to get in that relationship in size, in location, in shape between the handle and the main structure right before moving forward. But once those proportions look good to me, I then start really observing any negative space that I might see, that hole that I was talking about before, created by that handle. I try my best to get in that hole. Once I have the main shape and the negative shape cut out, I then observe that reference photo closely and I ask myself, what planes am I able to see of this handle from this perspective? Am I able to see the top plane, the side plane, the inner plane or bottom plane? When it comes to mugs and cups like this, you're gonna see twists and turns. And sometimes the top plane turns into a side plane and then into the bottom plane. And that makes things tricky. But I try to simplify things for myself by just recreating the shapes that I see for those different planes to the best of my abilities. And it can be quite confusing to tell what's what, especially because the planes are not flat. There is often a curve to these planes. But for example, in this cup right here, I can see the upper plane, which turns into a side plane. I can see the front plane, and I can see a couple of sections of the inner plane. So try to make sense of the different planes or sides that you're able to see, and then just try to get in those shapes created by the different planes as best as you can. If it's difficult for you to see those planes, I would recommend looking for a simpler mug or a mug that has a handle that has flatter planes or sides. But another issue that could be making seeing those plane changes more difficult throughout the handle can definitely be having a photo with poor lighting. If your photo is over or underexposed and you cannot see those value or tone changes throughout that handle, that is also going to make it more difficult to understand where plane changes are happening. And this is because the planes that are facing toward the light are going to be lighter in value usually, and the planes which are facing away from the light, which are usually the inner or underneath planes of the handle, are usually going to be darker. And of course, this kind of object is usually made of a material that is quite smooth and reflective, so we are going to see bright highlights and value changes, which can make things trickier. But simply understanding that planes that are facing away from the light are going to be darker than planes that are facing toward the light, and understanding that value changes throughout the structure can really mean that there is a plane change going on, can help us draw things more effectively, and we can use our critical thinking skills to make up for the information that we're lacking visually. Alright, you guys, that is gonna do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up, because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye guys!